in a lot of America. In general, people assume that you turn on the tap and water comes out, and it's easily accessible. Every home has access to fresh water, and you turn the tap and it comes out, which sounds great. But first of all, water is a finite resource, and art is a finite resource, and water is not free. It actually takes a lot of infrastructure, and a lot of money, and a lot of management. And so I think that's the analogy between that and music is pretty clear.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath. I'm so glad to have you here and learn more about the mission of this show and what's going on at contrabassconversations.com. And I love hearing people's stories. I'd love to hear from you. And the best way to get in touch with me is by emailing me feedback@contrabassconversations.com. I know you're going to love today's episode featuring Ben Allison. Now, Ben is a bassist, a composer, he's an educator, he's an advocate who's been active in the jazz scene for nearly 30 years. He's called by the Boston Globe one of today's best young jazz musicians, and by Jazz Times, a visionary composer, adventurous improviser, and strong organizational voice on the New York City jazz scene. He's also released 11 albums, and he's about to release his next album. So we dig into the recording process behind this latest album, which he's crowdsourcing. We talk about that too. We talk about what his role is like as president of the board of the New York chapter of the Recording Academy. That's the organization that runs the Grammys, what that job is like. We also dig into the effects that streaming music has had, Spotify, YouTube, and those kind of companies, and what their business model really is. Fascinating conversation. And we also talk about how Ben has become addicted to mixing with these last couple albums. I'm also so thrilled to have D'Addario Strings as a sponsor for Contrabass Conversations. And I want to let you know a little bit about their Zyx strings, which are synthetic strings. They're a synthetic gut string. They have a gut-like sound. I've been using them for the past couple of months, really enjoying them. They're great as pizzicato strings. They've had a great growl and sustain. They sound great under the bow, and you can learn more about them at D'Addario Strings. Just check out the website for a link. And also, we're doing a giveaway with D'Addario. If you go to contrabassconversations.com/strings, fill out that survey and you'll be enrolled. I'd also like to thank Bass Capos for providing hosting for Contrabass Conversations. Bass Capos are an excellent choice for any bass player looking to implement or using a double bass extension. They're easy to install and adjust. They're cheaper and more reliable than hand-built latches. They're also lighter and quicker to operate. And you can learn more at basscapos.com. We also open and close today with a couple of short clips from Ben's previous solo album, The Stars Look Very Different Today. And we have a link to this album in the show notes. Okay, here we go with our conversation featuring Ben Allison. Do you have a solid release date for the album, or when's that going to be coming out?
So this record is going to be the second that I've produced myself, so I can kind of set the release date whenever I want.
Yeah.
My plan is to do it in early April.
Okay. That
seems about right timing-wise. I mean, we're going to be recording in early January, and then I'm going to be kind of out on the road for on and off for about 6 weeks. And during that time, I'm going to be doing my best to kind of get the mixes together and everything like that, and get it into production. The vinyl will take a little bit longer, but I think somewhere around the April time frame is when I'm thinking of releasing the bulk of it, and then the vinyl version will come a little bit later.
Okay, cool. That's got to be one of the advantages of doing your own thing, is not being beholden to it has to come out, bang, March 15th or anything like that.
That's right. I mean, although I do like deadlines, but all the deadlines are self-imposed these days, which is nice. So I have freedom and I can kind of coordinate things the way I want rather than the way someone else wants. But still, it's important to have deadlines. I basically, at this point, work, put a schedule together really on paper about how things are going to roll out. And there are a lot of moving pieces
Yeah.
One of the things about being an independent artist now is that you actually have to coordinate all of those moving pieces, from the tours to the musicians to the production to the promotion and all that sort of thing, which is fun and challenging. Freedom, but more work.
Right.
Calculus, right?
Yeah.
Freedom and work are inversely proportional.
Yeah. That's a good line. I like that. I think I saw, are you going to be out in California? I thought I saw you're playing in San Jose or somewhere like that coming up here.
That's right. Yeah, we got a West Coast tour. I think we'll be out from about February 23rd or 4th until about March 10th.
Okay. Are
the approximate date ranges. And it's mostly in California, and then we kind of end up in Vancouver at the end. We just kind of work our way up.
Nice.
It'll be easy. It's nice. It's nice when everything lines up nicely like that in a row. So yeah, we'll be just kind of working our way up from the bottom of California up to Vancouver.
Cool. Yeah, I live out here in San Francisco, so I'll try to catch one of your West Coast shows. That'd be great. Man, well, it's so great to talk to you. There are tons of things we could talk about, but one thing that really connected with me, and that's got to be just so hard for people, independent artists, or just is the whole like streaming thing and YouTube. And you wrote, was I reading something about how you experimented with monetizing on YouTube and just like the disturbingly low dollar value that actually brought you? Yeah,
I mean, it's an ongoing debate. Actually, in the last, since I wrote that blog piece, I've actually gotten fairly involved in the Recording Academy. So I'm actually now the president of the New York chapter of the Recording Academy. That's the organization behind the Grammys. And one of the things the Recording Academy's gotten increasingly involved with is advocacy. And so that's really what drew me to it. I was, as an independent artist, I mean, I've been on a label for many years, but as an independent artist, really came up against the realities of the business side in a way that I probably hadn't while I was signed to a label. And also everything's been so kind of in flux and upended by these kind of new distribution methods. Mm-hmm. And so when I was given the chance to get involved in the Recording Academy, it just gave me this kind of a platform to talk about these things, and also connected me to the people who are really trying to affect change and first of all, figure out what's going on, and secondly, try to come up with some real solutions.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, YouTube has been a big thorn in the side for a lot of artists, and not just independent artists, but really everybody on the creative side, on the people who actually create music. I mean, we live in a strange time. I mean, we artists and we record labels, we love our audiences. We love when they check out our music. We want to make it as available as possible. We embrace technology. I use it every day. I mean, these are all kind of givens. On the other hand, more people get their music from companies that don't sell music than ever before. And so that's really the paradigm shift. So there's been this kind of move away from artists creating records, record labels, making them and selling them, distribution channels, putting them right into the hands of the consumer, and the consumer paying for them. That kind of model that has really built the music industry as we know it over the last 100 years has really been upended by these kind of new delivery systems.
Yeah.
So now you have companies that are really have no vested interest in music per se, because they're not selling music, they're selling ad space and they're accumulating data.
Yeah.
And that's where they're being monetized, and they're financed by, Morgan Stanley with venture capital. But, Morgan Stanley isn't interested in selling records. That's not really where they're,
right. Yeah, exactly.
Where their interest is, right?
Yeah, right.
In the monetization of it and the value of it. And the valuation of these companies is really based on the data, the user data that they accumulate, and they're using music kind of as the lure to get that user data. And it's kind of a big concept, but it's been happening gradually, but pretty strongly over the last 6, 7, 8 years. And so a lot of artists have become concerned about that as the industry's moved in that direction. It's just an uncertain time, and we're kind of figuring it out. I mean, labels are slowly figuring out how to make money in this way, but artists and labels aren't always on the same page.
Right.
Obviously. Unfortunately, so it just puts the creative side in an awkward position.
Oh, yeah.
To be, as always, at the bottom of the food chain, and it's just, it's a tricky time. So these are the kind of things that we talk about on the Recording Academy. A lot of indie artists and mainstream artists, for that matter, these days are increasingly talking about it and kind of bringing these problems to light. Mm-hmm. And the next step is to, figure out solutions.
Yeah, I read somewhere about the currencies of tomorrow are going to be user data and water, and you can definitely see the water thing out here in California. But it's just like this white hot pace of technological innovation. I mean, it's unbelievable. Like the last 5, 6, 8 years. I mean, you've been active for the last few decades. And what does it look like now versus if we rewind 20 years ago, say?
Well, I mean, it's totally different.
Yeah.
It's hard to sum up in a few sentences, and I know you want to keep your podcast.
No, don't worry. No,
it's hard to unpack that question, but one of the, as I said before, one of the main shifts is kind of how people access music. Mm-hmm. It's in one ways it's more ubiquitous than ever.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. I mean, music is just everywhere. Just the advent of the the iPhone and just the way people stream stuff and the way people have access to music in just all these different ways makes it more available, which is great. I mean, I'm all for that. When I was coming up as a kid, I was fortunate because I'm 50. So I come from a generation of people who actually bought records, and not just CDs. I mean, I actually bought vinyl records. And back then I used to go into the record store when I was 13 and 15 and everything. And I was fortunate to have a great record store in my hometown of New Haven. And the record guy, I don't know if you ever saw that movie. Is it High Fidelity?
Oh, I love that movie. Yeah.
Jack Black. Yeah. He plays the total record store dweeb. Yeah. I had that guy at that record store. This guy was he just knew a lot about music. And I would come in and he would just put stuff in my hands. So it was this kind of direct curation of somebody who really knew a lot about music and would connect the dots for me in really interesting ways. So, I grew up listening to a lot of rock. I mean, I love Zeppelin. And he's like, oh, he's like, what do you love about Zeppelin? I said, well, I love the blues aspect of it, and I just love the kind of shredding guitar. I'm 12 years old.
Yeah.
And he said, oh, if you love shredding guitar, you're going to love Pat Metheny. I was like, okay, never heard of this guy.
Right.
And he gave me a Pat Metheny record. Now, in retrospect, Pat Metheny and Led Zeppelin have little to do with one another in a lot of ways. On the other hand, Pat Metheny was, he's shredding on guitar for one thing, and he had this kind of folk meets jazz kind of sensibility back then. At least that's how it sounded to me. Mm-hmm. And Pat Metheny, I started looking into him, and he was talking about Ornette Coleman. And so the second record I bought was an Ornette Coleman record.
Whoa!
So from Zeppelin to Pat Metheny to Ornette Coleman. That only happens with a record store geek.
Right.
Amazon, you may also algorithm is not going to make that happen for you.
For sure.
So for a young musician coming up, having somebody who is knowledgeable about music and could connect the dots in interesting ways was really important. And so that's, while music is more ubiquitous these days, I think also in a way sometimes it's harder for younger people who don't have that personal human curation going on. There's always been record labels that have curated things, and even when I was a kid, you had to go out and find the cool stuff. But I think in some ways it's become harder. And also it's overwhelming. So people have access to so much and there's so much music kind of in their face and so much media in general that sometimes it just becomes overwhelming, and I'm afraid people are more likely to give up and just kind of accept what's kind of pushed to their device rather than hunt out stuff. So that's one concern artists have.
Yeah, it's just the overwhelm. It's like the same problem, but from the opposite direction. You have to go out and hunt for stuff, and now you're just drowned. A friend of mine teaches in Queens at that Queensboro Community College, teaches music, and he said that his job has evolved to the point where he feels like basically his job now is he's the curator of the YouTube. Like the majority of what he does is play YouTube videos of XYZ for his students, and his job is just to be the person who selects the videos, which is radically different than 15 years ago.
But that's okay, because he's human curating. I mean, that's meaningful. Like so just to kind of reemphasize, like to me there's nothing. I don't care how people get it. I mean, if they get it streamed or if they get it on vinyl, the delivery method is not inherently important, right? Because technology changes. And, it's not like I'm bemoaning the death of the 8-track as being the end of music.
Right.
I don't care as long as people have access to it. And also that they're connected to the artists and kind of appreciate what I think of as the inherent value of music.
Yeah.
Which is the other problem. And it's interesting you brought up water before, because, what's his name? Daniel Ek, one of the founders of Spotify, actually referred to music as being like water. He said, we want music to be like water. You turn the tap and it comes out.
Oh.
Which sounds great. But the problem is that a lot of people come to expect, or at least in our country, now in other parts of the world, certainly not, but in a lot of America, and maybe California's growing, is slightly different these days, but in general, people assume that you turn on the tap and water comes out, and that's an easy thing. I mean, what he was trying to say is that's an easy thing. It's easily accessible. Every home has access to fresh water, and you turn the tap and it comes out, which sounds great, and we love that. But first of all, water is a finite resource, and art is a finite resource, and water is not free. It actually takes a lot of infrastructure, and a lot of money, and a lot of protecting waterways, and a lot of management, frankly. And so I think that's the analogy between that and music is pretty clear. We need that kind of management. We need people minding the shop. We need people making sure that the consumer appreciates, even if they're not always conscious of it, because they're busy, they're working, they just need to brush their teeth, they're not thinking about this, but somebody behind the scenes is making sure that the value of this is accounted for.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. There's a blog post or essay or whatever written by Kevin Kelly, who was the founder of Wired, or editor of Wired magazine. He wrote a piece called 1,000 True Fans, and it's all about how independent artists can make a living in this era we live in now. And his whole theory is that just anything that can be digitally replicated, there's just this downward pressure toward free. And I remember something you wrote on your site, you were talking about if you search Ben Allison free download or something like that, this like staggering, it's like this overwhelm on Google, right? Much of which is malware that you might click on. But so how to actually make a living as an artist in this era? Kevin says you got to find 1,000 true fans, or whatever your metric is, like 1,000 people that are like your super fans. They'll spend $100 a year on you, buying your vinyl version, buying the premium box set, whatever, going to your shows, and you can make it work. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, because I see how you're marketing the new album with the pledge and the different levels, which I think is totally cool. Like, does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, it resonates with me. I mean, I think there's lots of different ways to do this. This, you mentioned the pledge thing, that this is a new thing. So just for the listeners, I'm crowdsourcing my new album. I've never done that before. So, just backing up a few decades,
sure.
A few decades ago, some colleagues of mine and myself, we started a nonprofit called the Jazz Composers Collective, which was really kind of we went full on and we incorporated, we became nonprofit. We went through the whole process. We applied for funding from various foundations. We had annual fund drives. Really our stated purpose was to present new music, really focus our audience's attention on kind of the new creative music that was happening in New York at the time. So I'm totally down for finding, developing, building audiences kind of almost in a grassroots sort of way. That's really been part of my whole life in music. But after being on an independent label where they did, I always built my audience, of course, touring and interacting with them. But now that I'm kind of on my own, I'm even more invested in that process. And so the idea of crowdsourcing an album is, fits within my worldview, but it's actually, I've never done it before. It's something new for me.
Yeah.
So it's like an experiment. I mean, in that way, I'm kind of buying into that concept of 1,000 fans, or whatever you want to say, of true fans who are, because I think there is definitely value to that. For people because there are a lot of people out there who, even if they're not totally consciously aware of some of the dynamics that we just talked about in the last segment, about the devaluation of music and the struggles and et cetera, they kind of feel it intuitively. And I think the resurgence of vinyl, people's interest in vinyl and tangible things and connecting music to a physical delivery system is part of that. People feeling a little alienated by some of the technology. You look at an iPhone and it's great when the screen's on, but when it's off, it's a black hunk of plastic and metal.
Right. It's
not really meaningful until you access the content. The content is what makes it valuable. Just like, it's nothing really new. When you bought a CD, it wasn't the piece of plastic that you were paying $15 for. It's the music that's on it. It's the ideas that are contained on that piece of essentially useless plastic that you're paying for. So people get that, but it's increasingly I think people feel increasingly disconnected to the physicality of the product in a way. So anyway, it's a long way of getting around to my main point, which is, the idea of crowdsourcing a project and connecting directly to the people who are really interested in this. And it's been incredible to find people who some people just pre-order the record. And then there are other people who jump in on kind of higher levels and really want to engage in my process and want to know more about how the record is made. And it gives me a chance to engage my audience kind of on a deeper level and help them really produce the record. Because when I was on a label, the label produced the record in a way. They kind of financed the production of it, and that's important. And now I have to finance my own productions, and having really my core group of audience members help me finance the project is really meaningful, and I feel even more emotionally invested in it as a result.
Yeah, totally. Well, and just being able to grant those, if we want to call them super fans or whatever, the access. Like I know one of the levels was sit in on a rehearsal. Wasn't that one of the levels you're offering?
Yeah.
Yeah, how cool is that? Like I live mostly in the classical world. I play a lot of orchestra gigs, that kind of thing, and so we do similar things in that world where people are at a certain level. They come and they sit like within the orchestra, for a specific rehearsal or something like that, and they love it. They come up and ask questions. Oh, when you moved your bow, you did this, or why do you turn the page that way, or this or that, and they just love to geek out. What a great way to really connect with those true believers or super fans or whatever you want to call them.
That's right. And some people are looking for, they're interested in the music in a deep way. So as you say, they want to see also how it comes together. And whenever I talk to especially somebody who really doesn't know anything about music or anything about the kind of music I make, which has a lot of improvisation in it, they always ask the same, after the first beer, and after the first round of questions, then we've been sitting there chatting for a minute off stage after the show. Usually they'll say something like, "So, how do you guys know what to do?"
Uh-huh.
They're talking about improvisation.
Yeah.
And then they start asking, and then I can kind of describe the process and try to draw analogies that make sense to them.
Yeah.
And they want to know how it's put together and how does this music actually happen.
Mm-hmm.
And when you drill down on that level, it's actually, in my opinion, extremely interesting, and so interesting. In fact, I've devoted my life to it,
Yeah.
to the pursuit of trying to figure it out. But yeah, I mean, how do musicians improvise? How does a band put some new music together? What's the dynamic? There's so many things at play, so many things that are unspoken and just kind of happen in the moment, but other things that are really kind of hashed out in rehearsal. So giving people access to that kind of behind the scenes as the music's coming together and what actually happens as we're putting new ideas together and kind of crafting a new sound. To me, it's super interesting. I love it. So it's great to be able to offer that to certain people who want to check it out.
Well, and I think you were describing the rehearsals for, is it Maggies Farm? Is that right? Is that where you like to record?
Yeah, Maggies Farm is the studio. It's the label that I used to be on, which in a lot of ways, I mean, they probably don't want me to say this, but in a lot of ways, they're kind of defunct. What happened was the people who were really the movers and shakers behind the label stepped away and turned it over to their distribution company, and it became a different thing. And when that happened, that's when I jumped out. It was right about the time of my last option, which meant I was kind of free to do something else, and I chose to not do that. However, the original people that were involved in the label when I was there are still very active in different ways. And Maggies Farm is the studio owned by the label head, who used to be the label head, but he built this awesome studio. We made a lot of my records were made out there. So he basically converted an old barn into this super kick-ass studio out in rural Pennsylvania. So you go out there, you're essentially in the woods in an old 18th century barn.
Yeah.
That sounds amazing with primo gear, and there's nothing to do but make records. I mean, it's really just kind of an idyllic setting.
That's great. Yeah, I'll bet. And I'll bet get like removing yourself, especially like living in New York City, getting out somewhere, like talk about a great way to focus and just dig deep and get the creative juices flowing. Yeah.
So, I mean, my last record I made in New York, and it was so much fun, but he's like, hey, I want to come out and make this record, and can't turn down that offer. So why we're doing it there.
Now, I think I read somewhere on your site that you've become addicted to mixing. I think those are the words you used. And so, like, what is it about mixing that fascinates you? I've played around a little bit myself, but I'd love to know, like, how maybe just talk about that process a little bit.
Yeah. So when you're behind the bass and when you're on stage and when you're in a room and you're playing an instrument, it sounds the way it sounds. Right. So I'm used to the way a bass really sounds. When you get into a recording studio, it becomes a different thing. And so for some artists, they struggle with that, and they try to recreate in the studio the way their instruments sound, quote unquote, in real life, or the way something would naturally sound. And there are labels that try to document music in that way. Mm-hmm. For me, at the beginning of my career, I thought about that a lot, but then at some point early on, moved away from this desire to try to recreate what happens in real life and started to recognize the studio almost like an instrument in and of itself. Okay. So, and this isn't like a new concept. I mean, as long as there have been studios, there have been engineers who have been using them like tools.
Sure.
I mean, Jeff Emmerich changed recording when he made Revolver, and it's been going on for half a century or more. But it put it in my mind that, yeah, when we're in the studio, it's a different thing than when we're playing live, and it sounds different and it feels different from the musician's perspective. I mean, we're really separated. A lot of times we have headphones on, we're kind of separate from each other in a way that now I'm very comfortable with, and I'm thinking about the recording process is a little bit different than playing live, and trying to figure out ways to use the studio in, as I said, like an instrument, like in a creative way. And mixing is really, you record the record, you get the sounds down, you get all the takes, you get the best versions of the tunes that you can. And in jazz, those are just what happened that day. I mean, it's really of the moment. There's some stuff I write out, but a lot of it's improvised. So you're just kind of crossing your fingers that everybody kind of brings their A game, and it just feels like a powerful artistic statement. So assuming that's happened, which usually it does with good musicians, the next step is to kind of craft this sound to sound like something that feels good and sounds good. And the mixing process is where that happens. And there's so many little decisions you can make about how to make something sound a particular way. And that becomes really part of the creative process. And I've always been involved in that in all the records that I've made, but it's always been from behind, sitting on the couch behind the engineer as we're mixing, and they're doing their thing. And then I'm pitching in with kind of aesthetic calls here and there. But mixing your own record when it's just you and the gear, and you're actually pressing the buttons and making the decisions yourself and setting it up from scratch, it's kind of awesome.
Yeah, sure. Sure.
I mean, and for me, it was also a learning curve because I had never really done it completely from beginning to end myself. So I had to call on a lot of friends of mine and call on a lot of favors. And I'm fortunate to have been in this business for a long time. So I know a lot of great engineers, having worked with them, and I'm able to call them up. And it's amazing how many of them take time out of their day to give me ideas and advice and listen to mixes and feedback and suggestions. It's just awesome. So I was fortunate to have that, and I'm hoping that happens again this time around. And that's why I say I'm addicted to it, because I actually really love that process. For me, it's really part of the creative expression of the album.
Mm-hmm. No, it's so cool. I'm sort of like amateur, more in I'm a total neophyte in the jazz world of like mixing a jazz record, but I've always found it really fascinating. There's a book I read called Zen and the Art of Mixing. It's by Eric Seraphin. He goes by Mixer Man, and he's more in like the hip hop world and that kind of thing. But he talks about his process, and I know like for him, and we're talking about a different genre, but he's starting with the drums, and then he's usually going to the bass, and he talks about like carving out different frequency spectrums and like where it sits in the stereo mix. And like, do you have any sort of like, when you sit down to mix a tune, do you have like a general workflow? Like you start with X, you move to Y, like what do you do?
Yeah. What you just described does sound very much like the way a lot of people work.
Yeah.
And you are trying to do all the things you just mentioned. Those are really just basic things. That's like if you were describing how to play basketball, you pass the ball, you see
right.
the floor, you find your teammates, you look at your man, and you look at the ball, you've got the basket in the back of your head, you see, they're very general concepts about how you would put together a sound. But then there's all of these, really an infinite amount of subtle decisions, and a lot of it has to do with your process, and everybody's process is different. So for me, I'm creating really kind of my own process at this point. That's part of the fun of it. Maybe that's why I'm addicted to it.
Sure.
I don't have a process because I haven't done it enough to have my own firm process. On the other hand, I've interviewed a bunch of really high-level engineers and asked them about their process. I was talking to Chuck Zwicky and Tony Visconti and Adam Ayen and, all these people that are really kind of high-level engineers, and asking them, and Emily Lazar and Ann Mincielli, and just asking them about their process, like how do they put together mixes and how do they work and what's their style, and kind of learning their processes so that I can pick and choose what works for me. So that's 20% of it, and the other 80% of it is just trying shit to see what sounds good.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's kind of like, how you learn to play an instrument. You could study with anybody, but at the end of the day, you just got to figure out your thing, and you do that by doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I'm totally looking forward to this mixing process for the next record, and I intend to share the experience as best I can through my Pledge Music campaign, even after the campaign is, we're in like the last 22 days of it. Mm-hmm. As of today. By the time this airs, I suppose it would be much shorter. But even after it's resolved and concluded, I intend to post, the whole process all the way through till the end to just to kind of share my experience with it. But yeah, I find it very rewarding and exciting and interesting. I'm interested in it. It's where technology and art and sound collide.
Yeah.
Just like in my performance life, we talk about that all the time, and that's where we live. So this is kind of the same thing, but in the studio realm.
Yeah. Where technology, art, and sound collide. I like that. Yeah, that's great. And it is addictive. And I like how you're describing it. It almost becomes like an instrument of its own. Do you use Pro Tools? What do you use?
My DAW is Pro Tools. I mean, I write in Logic when I'm writing tunes. I write in Logic, as my last Pledge Music video will attest.
Okay.
And that's only just because it's easy. And then I score my stuff out in Sibelius. That's the charts that I give to the musicians.
Okay.
And then we record. The DAW of choice these days for me is, as always, has been Pro Tools, just because that's how I've always worked. So I'm very familiar with it, and I find it really easy to work in it. But yeah, I mean, the part that I do not do and will never do out of choice is the mastering process. So the mastering is where once everything's mixed and I've got, I think as close as I want to what I want the record to sound like, then I pass it off to the mastering engineer, and they're the ones who say, you got a problem here. Mm-hmm. Here's the problem. Having a second set of ears, not just I have lots of ears through the process, but like a definitive second set, people who are just super attuned, their ears are so good, they can hear everything in minute detail, weigh in on what's working and what's not, and correct any problems. Or in the case of my last album, I was fortunate to have a great mastering engineer, Randy Merrill, who was working at Masterdisc at the time, but I think he's now at Sterling. And he was gracious enough to allow me to bring my almost final mixes into Masterdisc and play them and listen down and isolate any issues that he saw, and then give me the chance to go back and fix the mix, the problems that were there, and then bring it back for final mastering so he didn't have to do as much. That's extraordinary. That was great because, sometimes once the mastering engineers have a 2-track mix, they're a little bit limited in terms of what they can. Certain things that they're big problems, if the mix is a little off in an important way, they're a little bit limited about what they can do without changing the entire phonics of the track. So
sure.
That was great.
Thank you so much, Ben. Great to have you on the show. And folks, check him out at his website, benallison.com. And that is going to do it for another episode of Contrabass Conversations. Thank you so much for following along with the show. We're coming up on our 300th episode. We're coming up on our 10-year anniversary. Isn't that amazing? So many things in store. I'm continuing to experiment with the format, trying to add more video, trying to try some different offshoots, and I'd love it if you aren't subscribed to the podcast. Go to contrabassconversations.com. You can subscribe in iTunes. You can subscribe with Google Play. You can subscribe via email. There are all sorts of ways to stay in touch. And if you're interested in supporting the show, whether financially or non-financially, there are all kinds of options we've got listed at contrabassconversations.com/support. All right, that's going to do it, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.